This is very exciting. Hi, I'm Dale Peterson, and this is the Unsolicited Response Show. Joining me on the show this week is Nicole Sundin. She is the Chief Product Officer at Axio. And also, Nicole, I noticed in your background you had a lot of UX experience. So we might dive into that at the end.
Mm-hmm. Yep, that is correct. Wonderful. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, that's great. And I had David White on a little while ago from Axio. Maybe I'll link to that show in the show notes. But let's start out. The reason I wanted to have you on board is we're hearing a lot about cyber risk quantification. And most of the people in ICS security, we talk risk a lot, but quite frankly, we lean very heavily on security controls to reduce likelihood and don't do as much that's really risk as sometimes we say we do or we hope to do. Mm-hmm. So we hear this term cyber risk quantification, CRQ. I noticed on your site there was a one sentence definition. Cyber risk quantification ascribes a financial value to each decision based on statistical modeling of risk and expected loss. Mm-hmm. So, okay, I kind of get that. That's a good broad term. But when I hear cyber risk quantification and this kind of new term and buzzword, I'm having a little difficulty understanding how this differs from other quantitative cyber risk things that we've been doing for decades. What do you see as the difference or nuance between cyber risk quantification and what we have been doing?
Yeah. So I think the biggest thing is if an event would occur, just name an event. I think we'll get to like what an event could be. Let's say a ransomware attack.
Okay.
What is it going to cost my organization? Right. And also, what is the likelihood of my exposure to this risk as well? Mm-hmm. At Axio, we focus much more on impact than likelihood, and it's purposeful. And I think this is why it's different than other metrics that people use, is because what CRQ does, if you focus on impact, it helps you speak the language of the business. Often CISOs have this issue. They go into their executive meetings and say, we're operating red, yellow, green, right? And that is a black box and people do not understand. Or we have this percent of likelihood of chance that a ransomware attack could happen to us because of X, Y, and Z. And a lot of people don't understand what that means. It's a black box and it's having a hard time communicating with the business. So what CRQ does is breaks down what I like to call the socio-technical gap, right? We're all coming from different places, different technical literacy, different cyber literacy. But there's one thing that everyone understands, which is it's going to cost me $10 million if this happens, right? And so what it does, it evens the playing field of language that you're using so everyone in the room can understand if this occurred, this is the risk we're carrying, this is how much it's going to cost. That's the first part of it.
Okay. Okay, go ahead. There's a second part too?
And I feel like in CRQ, I think people often stop there when they think of CRQ, right? Okay. There's a second and third part of it, which is now, everyone's understanding that it's going to cost $15 million for a ransomware attack if this happened to us this way. Are we covered by our cyber insurance? Overlaying that onto the scenario, right? Do we need to increase our cyber insurance? Are we carrying too much cyber insurance? Are we covered at all? And that's a question that, we bring in the risk people into the room and talk through that as well as with the business and the CFO. But also then starting to ask for new controls to mitigate that risk, right? So people often think CRQ is just this statistical exercise, but it's much bigger than that. It's how you plan your program. It's how you gauge performance, right? And that last piece is what's the most important. That's the outcome. But it gives you a starting point to start talking about impact and what the next controls or insurance moves are in the game.
How do you deal with the precision issue? This is one of the things I've participated in and more often viewed many, many debates about qualitative risk assessments versus quantitative risk methodologies. And at some point, if the precision is so bad, typically more on the likelihood side than on the consequence side. I think if you dig in, as we've seen with a lot of events, you don't always anticipate what all the costs and impacts are. But I would say your precision could be much higher on the impact side, but on the likelihood side, especially on things in the ICS world where they're so rare now, they're high impact, low frequency events. I see people using these broad chunks that, they're almost like high, medium, and low. If there's a 50% variance in precision or 50% range in
Mhm.
precision, I'm
Mhm.
not sure how much better that is in quality than a quantitative assessment. So how do you deal with this precision issue, both in collecting the data and also how do you report out that, hey, here's our number, but by the way, it could be plus or minus this amount?
Well, that's the thing. So we, in regards to likelihood, we think a range is the best, right? Because you're never going to say my likelihood of this group of events happening is 7.1125%. It doesn't matter, right? Like it is around 7% or a range between 7 and 10%. What we do at Axio is we get that we partner with a data provider called Scientia, which is a research
Mhm.
firm that breaks down a ton of research from a ton of different data sources by NAICS code, so your industry, and then also your revenue band, understanding there's differentiation between different
Mhm.
industries and when things happen, and also how much revenue you bring in. And we partner there. And we also use a methodology called susceptibility, which is a categorical variable, right? And you can start making inferences. Am I more or less likely to have this event occur over another? Because
Mhm.
it's easy for people to say, right? And this is just an example that we talk about a lot. What's bigger, an elephant or a mouse? Humans can do that,
Mhm.
right?
Yep.
And humans can also do, are we more or less likely for this catastrophic ransomware event to occur or maybe data breach this particular way? They can also talk about that because they're the subject matter experts. They know their environments better than anyone,
Mhm.
right? And so you can start to stack rank. You can also link up control assessments, which can be verified through automated data pulls, right? So it could be a self-assessment that you verify through automated data pulls to make sure things are accurate, to then also check your data and susceptibility. So that's a categorical variable, but then we also roll it all up with a data provider to suggest to our customers likelihood with Scientia.
Yeah. I'm
Yeah.
going to put a pin in that because we'll probably get into that when we go through the methodology
Mhm.
a little bit more. But I do think there's a pretty big difference between 7 and 10% and an elephant and a mouse.
Mhm. Right,
When
correct.
you're talking
Mhm.
elephant, and I'm
Mhm.
worried that in the ICS we're closer to the elephant and mouse than we are, but
Yeah.
we'll get into that. Uh, what about something like FAIR? Are you
Mhm.
familiar with the FAIR methodology? How does that compare to CRQ?
Well, the FAIR methodology is a methodology that in the CRQ space, right? We don't utilize the FAIR methodology. In fact, we're probably one of the only vendors in the space that doesn't. It's purposeful because we focus much more on impact, where they focus much more on that exposure likelihood. They have a
Mhm.
little bit of impact, but it's a little bit more black box from our perspective. But a lot of people utilize it and like it, right? We're just a different method from my perspective and
Mm.
much more focused on financial impact. And we really pride ourselves on transparency because when you do the precision issue, there is this thought process in the field that CRQ does have a precision issue. How can I trust these numbers? Right?
Mhm.
You're telling me it's going to be $15 million. How? And with our product, you can open it up. You can say, this is exactly how we got to it. You don't believe it? Okay, let's change the values, right? And then
Mhm.
tune it to get it to what you think is correct. And so there's much more transparency, defensibility, but also much more focus on financial impact on our side, where there is
Yeah.
a lot more likelihood. Mhm.
Well, without respect to the various methodologies, I just think in general, your, I guess, return or the better clarity or better precision you will get on risk is probably going to be higher in time spent on the impact side than
Yeah.
on the likelihood side, just because it's something you have the facts, you are going to do that, where likelihood you're dealing with, especially in the ICS case where there's so few things
Mhm.
happening, it's
Yeah.
much harder to say. So I like that. Now when I looked at some videos of the product, and I saw some that were related. The one that I wrote down was something related to the C2M2 compliance,
Mhm.
and you had other compliance sort of elements in this.
Yeah.
Does that tie into CRQ, or is that just another feature of the product?
It's both. So we host any maturity or compliance assessment that you want in the product.
Mhm,
Obviously, Dave White, who we talked about at the beginning of the podcast, was the original author of the
mhm,
C2M2. That ties into that susceptibility piece. So we can take the controls that you've done your self assessment on or data provide automation and plug them into the CRQ susceptibilities and give them ranges. And then what we can leverage your controls to tell you how susceptible you are to an
mm.
event occurring. So it's connected. And I think that's one of our value props. So we were just named a leader in the Forrester Wave for this in the CRQ space, and they explicitly called it out. Like, if you are a control-based shop, meaning you do assessments,
Mhm.
this is a good product for you because of that merger of data that is all connected in our product.
When I'm hearing and seeing quite a bit now, kind of on the flip side of that, you mentioned insurance. I'm seeing insurers now looking more and more at some of these standards or frameworks
Mhm.
and setting some of their questionnaires to align with some of those. So I would imagine, do you see insurers using this product as well, or is
Yeah,
that a related product?
we definitely have a lot of insurer partnerships. What we're seeing from our customers who utilize our product, a lot of assessment, but also CRQ, is that they're getting better coverage for less premiums because they're showing their work, right?
Hmm.
Because of this meld of what you're talking about versus an application questionnaire and their assessment, they're allowing the assessment to almost act as the application questionnaire to show their work, so they can have more visibility into programs to better fund their insurance policy. Mhm.
We're so new in this, and I know you're not an insurance expert, but we're so new in this. I think one of the things that I'm watching closely is if you attest that you have this control in place, and then an attacker somehow finds somewhere where it wasn't in place and is able to use that, does that void the insurance claim, or do they not have to pay out? Colonial Pipeline's a great example where
Mhm.
they use two-factor authentication almost everywhere, but there was a legacy system that was found where it wasn't used. Now, I'm hoping one mistake doesn't void something. It would have to be some pattern or something that said you didn't. But I'm expecting we're going to see some of that in the future. Have you heard anything about that?
I feel like there is a possibility for that, right? Which is why I think there is this tension, and I think both insurers, brokers, and insureds feel this, right? How
Hmm.
much do I share? How much is too much? Because I want to get covered. I don't want to pay a high premium from the insured perspective.
Right.
But the insurers want as much data as possible so they can make better underwriting decisions, obviously facilitated through the broker. But if you're showing your work, you might say, let's say we use a Filipini scale, right? So I'm partially implemented an MFA, not fully because I have this one system, right? And so they might
Hmm.
write the exclusion in the policy, but at least you know that exclusion is there, right? And maybe you can get a different policy to cover the exclusion instead of just, oh my gosh, I'm not covered now, right? At least you know there's some transparency from my
That's
perspective.
that's not what I'm really worried about, though,
Yeah.
Nicole. What I'm more worried about is I don't know about this one system, or I say that I
Yeah.
apply patches, and we know any patching program is not 100% successful.
Mhm.
So you say, yes, we apply patches on a monthly basis here, a quarterly basis there, and that is your plan.
Yeah.
But all of a sudden they find a system that wasn't patched. So I don't know that we have the answers to that yet, but I think that's the other part of this, asking these questions and sharing
Mhm.
this information two ways. It's going to be interesting. And they've worked through this in other markets. I can't believe they don't have the same system with, let's say, fire systems and such,
Right.
that they can't expect them to work all perfectly all the time.
Right. Absolutely. It's a lot of unknowns, right? I think we're in this gray space right now that we're just gonna continue to see what happens.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, but it's a hot space, right? I think that everyone is highly concerned about it, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
So just keep talking about it, and hopefully things will come to light.
Okay. One more impact question before actually two more before we get into the ransomware example. How do you deal with things, and this again is very much in the ICSOT world. How do you deal with impact of things that are not strictly financial, such as human safety
Mhm.
or environmental impact or customer impact.
Yeah.
Customer impact, environmental, I think is easier, but human safety, I mean,
Yeah.
are you putting a price on a person's life or a person losing a limb? How do they deal with that?
Yeah, so what we tend to, with our customers, what we tend to do around human safety specifically is to actually focus much more on injury than death. A lot of people actually in the OT space have a number for death of a person, which is quite sad, but an injury because that injury is long withstanding, right? It's not like you just pay it once. There is that
Mm,
long tail, and you can quantify that in dollars, right? It's not, and our professional services team, which is they're amazing and specifically focused on OT. A large group of them have done this model this with multiple, specifically energy OT companies, right?
mhm,
Um, Loss of business, and or that's a little bit easier, right? Because you can say like my revenue was X and I know that it wasn't, or my revenue projection was X, right? And maybe it didn't meet that way. So you can kind of start thinking through what hits you would take on your revenue. But personal safety is a tough one, but I think it's possible to do specifically if you focus on injury, right? And what kind of medical costs you're going to have to and insurance payouts and things like that. So,
yeah, customer impact, you have to make, I think the precision there is gonna be less, so when I think of financial, I'm in that case, for example, Clorox right now is a great
mhm,
example where they're unable to deliver products, so that is
yeah.
affecting their revenue
Mhm.
numbers, but a lot of times customer impact is also my customer no longer trusts me. They're looking for a new supplier, and that's going to
Yeah.
affect me not directly, but indirectly. But again, you can estimate those numbers. I'm just not sure how good the precision is on those estimates.
Yeah. Uh, the interesting thing, like, specifically around trust and, like, reputational damage, there's good research out there, right? That
Really?
says yeah, that says, this sort of event, let's say an example of reputational damage, right? Your Social Security number was breached in a data breach,
Hmm.
right? The sad thing is that for the most part, people are pretty used to that. And so they might take a ding and reputational breach or reputational damage right away, but it's gonna bounce back. Like, people are still shopping at Target, right? Even
Yeah.
though there
Yeah.
was, so there is good data around that because these things have been happening a lot in the field and people have been studying them, right? And so we pull that data in our product. We have suggested formulas that you can use, or our professional services team does a great job of guiding that. But they're known, right? You just have to look at the right research to then obviously manipulate the data and the formulas to make it work for you, right?
Okay.
Mhm.
And then the last thing before we get to our example here, we deal in our space with a lot of these potential high impact, low frequency events or fat tail events. You could think of someone getting into the OT environment and causing physical damage, a
Mhm.
la Stuxnet or the attempt with Triton or what happened in Ukraine. But we're talking about things that had a potential very large impact in two cases, potentially large in one. It didn't work, but that's three in the world
Mhm.
that we really know about. So how do you deal with something where it's in this CRQ where it's if it happens, it's going to be huge, but the numbers of it happening are so tiny that the if you were to use a formula, the risk would be considered very low and fall well down on what you should address.
Right. Well, at Axio, that's basically what we focus on the most, right? Is these low probability, high impact scenarios. And our reasoning behind that is because that's what's going to destroy you as an organization, right? These high frequency, low impact events, you're covered, right? You'll just pay it out, like it's not a big deal. So then, because we focus on that, we're quite good at knowing, number one, the customer is a subject matter expert about what their environments, right? So we really rely
Mhm,
on what their knowledge and what they know. But then pairing that with research on from other industries and things like that to really build out these scenarios. I think in some ways these are the most important things to focus on to understand the risk because it could destroy your business, right?
mhm.
And in some ways, maybe not the highest priority to solve, but maybe there's a control that you're already thinking about implementing that could cut through that impact. That would be great, right? And so then you can start applying even controls that you're just doing for best practices to look at it. And I think although maybe not as common, so there is a precision issue. That's why we use ranges, min,
Hmm.
expected max. It helps, and then you Monte Carlo it. It helps that precision issue with these events. Obviously, right, these longer tails, these fat tails, that is where the catastrophic events occur, right? Your insurance stops paying out, and that's when you start to get controls in there, whether it's people, process, or tech, to know that this can't happen, and here is why, right?
Hmm.
So, yeah.
Okay. Well, let's dive into one. So on your site, you say Axio has a 4-step process. 1, define scenarios. 2, calculate impact. 3, communicate results. 4, mitigate results.
Mhm.
So let's talk about the scenario that is, I would say, percentage wise, it's maybe low frequency, happening to 1% of the or less of the manufacturers or such, but it's not ultra low frequency like what we were talking about
Yeah.
before. And that's ransomware
Mhm.
getting on the IT network, causing an impact to operations because they
Mhm.
can't get their scheduling, their billing, their shipping, all those systems that
Mhm.
aren't on OT, but OT relies on. They can't get those to work.
Mhm.
So if we, so it's pretty easy to define that scenario, right? We can
Yep.
just look at things that have happened across the industry. Johnson Controls just announced this week
Yep.
that they're facing that.
Mhm.
Clorox didn't announce its ransomware yet. They're being a little cagey on what it was, but
Mhm.
odds are it was ransomware.
Right.
So we know the scenario. Calculate impact seems relatively straightforward, although I'm not sure. Are you seeing many people actually go through that process? Because I think that's one of the things we're seeing. A lot of these manufacturers are surprised
Yeah.
when IT goes out that they can't ship product.
Right. Well, I mean, that's, the core of our business, right? And so how we do it is we have 4 different categories, first and third party financial and first and third party tangible. Obviously, that links back into insurance, so you can do the coverage, which has
Hmm.
the impact category. So if you walk down our first category, it'll say, how much is your forensics here,
Hmm.
right? Here's a suggested formula, right? What's your reputational damage? Here's your suggested formula, right? And you just walk through, is this going to affect us? You could also add things as well. And obviously our customers do the impact formulas.
Hmm.
I think a lot of people don't, right? We obviously don't have a monopoly on the space. So our customers are doing this to calculate the formulas through suggestion and or with our professional services team. And then we also have a catalog, right, that just does it for you that you can tune. And then then you have your scenarios, right? And this takes hours in our product, not months, not years, not weeks, like hours, right, to do these scenarios, which I think is quite valuable. So then you have the data, the dollar data. Mhm.
Well, how is that possible if the company hasn't thought through this?
Because what the premise, okay, so the catalog we have, it makes some assumptions about you, right?
Hmm.
And so then you can go in and you're starting and you can tune. The
Hmm.
workshops methodology that we do, we get a lot of people in a room, right? We get legal, we get finance, we get IT, we get the red teams. They sit together and talk about the scenario. And actually, this is where a lot of good data outside of just our estimated values, just good data of how this could happen, right? So to your point
Mm.
about I didn't know this we didn't have MFA on the system. Some of the times that comes out in these conversations because these people are not getting together as frequently as you think they would, right? They're doing their firefighting, they're doing their own things. So they're getting together to have these formulas and there's estimated values and you say, how much would forensics be? CISO, right? You have a contract with them. CFO, legal, how much are we paying for every 15 minutes of legal? Right. And they're asking these questions together as a group discussing, once again, breaking down that socio-technical gap because we're using hours and dollars, not highly technical terms. And because they're suggested formulas, you have a start, right? It's really guiding you, which I think is
Well,
important.
but you would need to know somehow. You'd have to take the time to say, for example, my operations can only run for 1 day
Yeah.
if this system isn't available or that system isn't available. And a lot of times that's a surprise when things happen. So
Hmm.
that's a thing that I would think would be more difficult to understand in an hour, but or in a couple hours. But
Yeah.
perhaps if you had the right, 5 people in the room, maybe you could get there
Yeah, and I
for a
think
scenario.
or you can come back to it and say, "We didn't answer this question. We gotta let's go research this really quick," right? And come back and put
Mhm,
the number in. But what we find in these workshops that it's not a finger in the wind. There's always someone that knows about this one thing that everyone is surprised about, right?
mm,
Because at the end of the day, these people that are working in these environments, they know their systems, right? They deeply know them. And they might not there's not maybe not collective knowledge, but one person might know this one thing that we can introduce into the modeling, right?
mhm.
So
No, I can see that with the right people. So maybe for a scenario, if you told me if you get the right 5 people in the room, they can figure out the
mhm,
impact in 2 to 3 hours. I That to me is believable.
yeah.
Doing it on a checklist, I'm a little less believable, but
Yeah, no, it's definitely and, like, that's the thing, right? So, in order for CRQ to work, right, your organization really has to buy in and believe, right? Because how hard is it to get these people in a room together? It's quite hard, right?
mm,
But once you get them in, the value is worth it, right? Because you're finding out these things, and these people are often not coming together to talk about these certain events that could impact the business. So, yeah.
yeah, oh, and not for any bad reason, but they're dealing with their own area,
Well,
right?
they're
It's
firefighting. They're
they're
big
100%
yeah,
busy making sure what they're responsible is working for. So this
yeah,
cross require cross dependence
mhm.
isn't really something they worry about because they just trust that the other people are going to do their job.
100%, and, like,
Yeah.
and I don't think people talk about it enough. Security teams, operations teams, everyone is busy, right?
Hmm.
Everyone is swamped. Everyone is doing more than they should in some ways, right? Because they're working nights and weekends. So they just don't have the time for collaboration. And that's why CRQ is really powerful, bridging the socio-technical gap, because it puts them together in a room and makes them talk, right? And really bring out the subject matter expert that they all have about their organization that then benefits them because they're addressing the risk.
Hmm. Now let's get this is a good chance to go back to precision. So I'm
Mhm,
with you on customer impact. We can
mhm,
get there
mhm,
with the right people in the room. But even in this example that we talk about, which isn't as bad as the example I gave earlier, where the bad guys get into the OT network, are really smart and break products and things like that, but just the simple ransomware on IT in a manufacturing environment.
mhm.
We have many, many cases of that happening, but I'm a little unsure about how you get to a number of what is the likelihood of that happening given a set of security controls, given a set of data. I would think the range would just be so large on that
Yeah.
that you'd have to have that it would start to make it much less. I guess you could use it for prioritizing, but in terms of actually coming up with numbers that you would then hit to insurance, it'd be very difficult.
Yeah, yeah, so that's why we really do on these individual scenarios focus on susceptibility because
Hmm.
it's never gonna be 0, right? We already
Yep.
acknowledged that we focus on, low probability, high impact events, right? And so
Hmm.
of these low probability, high impact events, you can say which ones are more likely to happen, right? You do that categorization. I won't use a mouse and an elephant this time. I'll use, a zebra and a horse. You can kind of tell
Hmm.
which one is
Yeah.
going to be bigger, and you categorize. But for the most part, it's for prioritization. To your point of now, which ones do I got to go fix for my risk, or which ones do I have to go talk to my broker to get more insurance on? Because at the end of the day, it's not 0. So it doesn't. In some ways, probability doesn't matter. I mean, of course it matters, but it doesn't matter as much as the impact, right?
Mm.
And then that's also why we use a data provider because I, calculating this on your own or organization is very time consuming, very difficult. And there's tons of data out there that Scientia can provide to Axio customers that guides them in that conversation, right?
Is there a human error factor where you
Abs-
say we have these security controls, but we only say they're going to be 95% effective because there's going to be 5% human error. Is there anything like that worked in?
Worked into our modeling? Yes. So
Yeah.
we have this whole entire thing called assumptions, right? Where these are all the assumptions I'm making, and human error is one, but also that's also why we do the ranges, right? Min, expected, max,
Hmm.
to discuss the ranges of possibility that will in human error. Just like anything else, humans are humans. There is going to be error, but also there's ways for you to address the error and tune it, right? Which I think is also very important. We're not black box, right? You can go in and be like, if you found something new or discovered something new 2 months from now after you did this, you can go in and change it. So
Hmm.
yeah, of course, there's human error, contingencies involved in our
Okay.
model.
Okay.
Mhm.
Now I'm going to shift a little bit. I'm talking to Nicole Sundin. She's with Axio, the chief product officer there. Uh, we've been talking about CRQ, but I just wanted in the 10 minutes or so we have left, you have a background and a lot of experience in UX, user experience. And
Mhm.
I read and watched some of the things you wrote. And one of the things I found fascinating was this idea that you as a designer or a product developer, you need to think about two personas. Can you maybe explain those two personas and why
Yeah.
a product needs to worry about both of them?
Yeah. I'm in this niche population of user experience professionals that have focused on security, and in a very small sample size, but I've dedicated my career to a concept of what I call usable security, which means
Hmm.
um, security products need to be usable to, number one, help the organization as a protective control, but also
Hmm.
we shouldn't be impacting users to a detrimental effect when implementing security controls to inhibit their workflow, right? And so
Hmm.
I believe when you're designing or a product, both from the product perspective, the engineering perspective, the design perspective, you have to think about two personas. One, the configuration persona. This is your sysadmin, your IT help desk person, right? And they're the ones setting up the product. They're the ones, and they want things much different than the other persona, which is what I call the utilization persona. We'll go back to it in a second. They want things to be difficult. They think that more clicks equals more security, right? And that is a known fact, and which is, if it's harder to implement, it means it's more secure, right? There's this mental model that they just have. It's changing a little bit as new professionals come into the profession, but for the most part, it is still the same, right? Because there's lots of checks and balances. Now, it is the exact opposite for the utilization persona, right? If you think about how to effectively roll out an MFA or a password vault, they want it to be very simple. That browser extension has to work, otherwise they're not going to use that vault, right? Simple, seamless in their workflow. They don't want to be interrupted by security. And now, as a designer and as a product person, two wildly different personas, right? But you have to think about both and test against both to really make sure that your product is effectively securing the organization, right?
Hmm. Well, that
Mhm.
makes sense. And I really am. I'm getting a little nervous because we are seeing more security things being pushed to. In our case, the utilization person would be
Mhm.
the operator in
Mhm.
the control room,
Mhm.
and there's the idea we hear this thing. Everyone needs to care about security, and they're creating a longer list of things that the utilization or user needs to do. And I worry about that because I see that as just almost destined to fail
Well, and
if we make their job harder.
the reality is people will find workarounds, right? If it's too hard to implement into their workflow, right?
Hmm.
And it's hard to say that, from the security perspective, like, well, how could they find a workaround? They'll find one, right? Where they don't have to use whatever security that you're implementing. They'll go sweet talk to the IT team, right? And be like,
Hmm.
could you just put email on my phone, please? Right? I need it for this, right? And because humans are humans, they'll do that. They'll make these workarounds for them. And so really it's about creating a seamless interaction, thinking about workflow that isn't inhibiting,
Hmm.
right? It's in fact maybe enhancing. They can find value in it. It's even better to make them care about security, right?
Now, one other UX thing I wanted to talk to you about, because we're seeing it in the security products, not so much the risk products. They call themselves a risk, but sometimes they'll just have like critical. They'll have a couple of risk categories that they'll bundle things in. Like you can see this with vulnerabilities, for example. they'll look at the CVSS score and they'll say, we
Mhm.
have to patch this, but that's not really an impact criticality. That's more of a technical
Yeah,
criticality.
yeah.
But we're seeing, for example, a desire for the CISO to look at one screen and see where their problems are in IT and OT. And one of the challenges is that the security controls you would apply to the two are actually different. So, for
Mhm.
example, security patching in the enterprise network is very important because it's wide open and people are doing email and all this sort of thing.
Mhm.
Whereas security patching in the OT environment, especially that's not exposed,
Yeah.
is of much lesser value and
Mhm.
much more risky. But we're seeing sometimes the results rolled up to the interface that says how many security patches are missing,
Yeah.
and OT is seeing this. Oh, OT is terrible, and IT is
Mhm.
great, and it's almost like OT is destined to fail
Yeah.
unless there's some adjustment of what's important.
Mhm.
How should this is probably a totally unfair question, but how should someone designing a UX deal with something like that?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, number 1, single pane of glass solutions don't work in general, right? And I know every
Mm,
product company wants a single pane of glass. I want you to see everything that's available, and I want you to use all these visualization tools to make decisions.
mm,
Well, the reason why they don't work is people have bad visualization literacy, and everyone has bad visualization literacy. There was a test that, like, only, like 10% of the population can read all these graphs. There was a test in human centered computing, which is okay. So that's what people are using to do single pane of glass. Then user UX professionals will then just, okay, then you drill down, drill down, drill down, drill down. You've lost all context at that point, right? What's the
mhm.
point of single pane of glass anymore, anyways? Okay, so I think single pane of glass is in some ways bogus from the UX perspective,
Interesting.
out of the way, um, because it doesn't situate you in the problem, right?
Mhm,
Because you're all over the place and you have bad visualization literacy. But then it's compounded now when you're taking categorically two very distinct sets of data. Because the reason why you have a single pane of glass in some ways is to do comparisons. Well, you already acknowledged that's not a fair comparison for OT and IT, right?
mm,
So then you got to break them out, right? And the only way that you know this, Dale, right, is having conversations with the CISO that have to focus on IT and OT. And this is the problem with product and UX today in cybersecurity is they're not having those conversations. So they probably don't even know that this exists. They think they're probably helping the user. Instead, they're actually making their life much more complicated, right? And maybe um, not helping them at all, actually. And so you got to break it out, situate people in the data that makes sense to be situated and to do comparisons. Break down the visualization literacy with numbers and graphs, right? So people can look at it and then allow people to export things that they can play around with themselves because a lot of times people with strong math literacy want to create their own do their own mathing, right, by
mhm.
themselves outside of a product, right? Or
Yeah.
inside of a product if you can do it there, but you gotta take things and put people in context to where they are and what decisions are being made and what problems they're trying to solve and not just smash data together, right?
Wow, I'm gonna have to really think about that. That single pane of glass comment is very interesting, and I think it's funny what you talk about people not having, as a rule, not having good visualization. What'd
Mhm.
you call that?
Literacy.
Visualization
Literacy.
literacy.
Mhm.
It's kind of like, my first job was as a cryptanalyst, and I just realized people are terrible at understanding random. They look at data and they can't understand whether it's random or non-random.
Mhm.
And even cryptanalysts that dealt with it for a long time would see patterns and then they say, no, it's
No.
just random.
Mhm.
Okay, well, we're kind of at the end here, but I wanted to give you a chance. Was there something that you wanted to talk to our audience about related to CRQ or UX, or
Yeah.
are you pretty happy with where we are?
I'll just do one final point that CRQ is in some ways, an umbrella, right? The CRQ
Hmm.
part is a great data collection activity to help you plan and manage your program, right? Especially if you focus on impact. And so if you're looking for help around that, like Axio is the place to be to break down that socio-technical gap and also help you plan and manage, right? Because I think these are where there's a lot of ad hoc, disparate work happening in organizations that technology could help you solve, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
Well, it's certainly not an endorsement of Axio to me. They're certainly one of the ones you should look at, but we will definitely include the link to the site in the show notes, and I would encourage people to check it out. It's an area that I think the listeners, the viewers of this podcast, this show, really need to understand more about it. And I found it to be a good source of information. So, Nicole, thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks, Dale.